New York Times bestselling author Lee Strobel is my special guest today on the Fearless Podcast. Right now, we're all hunkered down in our basements, eating tuna fish out of a can, and the pandemic is not going anywhere anytime soon. So your church, your ministry, your organization is going to be digital for the foreseeable future. You have a choice to make. You can either go Google or go Amish. Listen, you can do this. I can help. Jump on over to jonathanherron.com for tons of free resources and content. We can help your organization make a holy shift at jonathanherron.com. I'm Jonathan Herron, a guy from Iowa who married his high school sweetheart and adopted 5 amazing kiddos. 7 years ago, I started a new modern church from scratch that is now the 11th fastest growing church in America. I also wrote a best-selling book on using principles of comedy and leadership, and along the way, I've discovered a passion for helping ordinary people jumpstart their lives and fearlessly chase their dreams and purposes in life. So each week, I'll be sharing insanely practical advice and inspiring interviews to help you jumpstart your life and become fearless. These are the tools to change your life. This is the Fearless Podcast. Lee Strobel. I just admitted to you that I'm nervous. I have to be a fan.
Nervous?
Well, I have to be a fanboy just for a moment. Just indulge me for one moment.
Sure.
To set this interview up, because it was on my bucket list to meet you, so I can scratch that off the bucket list. And here's why. In the 90s, I was a college student in Chicago studying comedy at Second City.
Oh, really?
That was the direction that I felt like I was being called towards.
Wow.
Ended up at a party with Chris Farley 2 nights before he died.
Oh, my goodness.
So that shakes you up because you see someone rich and famous die, and you're surrounded by friends with all different belief systems. And I'd grown up in the church, but there was this much dust on my Bible cover.
Yeah.
So I investigated everything. This is before Google. I had to read the Quran, read the Book of Mormon. 1 Corinthians 15 grabbed me because of the history, the evidence. And so I went to a bookstore and I said, what do I do after reading through the Bible? And it was 1998, and on the capstand was The Case for Christ.
Awesome.
And literally, I picked up that book. It was a game changer. Married my high school sweetheart, went to seminary. This November, I'm coming up on 20 years in full-time ministry.
Wow.
And then to add a little cherry on top, this is the influence you have on people's lives. This church, we started from scratch 7 years ago in Michigan, and it's now the 11th fastest growing church in America.
Oh, my goodness. That is just awesome.
But here's the thing.
We can end right now. I mean, it's not going to get any better than that. That's just, that's awesome.
But I share that to say thank you, because your books, you've written over 20 books. Mark Middleberg, who's been a guest on this podcast. Yeah. All your writings on evangelism and apologetics have really fueled my ministry, and I know for many of our listeners, you've been a pioneer. You've inspired so many of us, and so I just wanted to start off by saying thank you.
That's so awesome, Jonathan. That's so inspiring and encouraging, and I appreciate you telling me. It's a wonderful thing about books. You just never know. I could be asleep here in Houston, and somebody in China could be reading a translation of my book in the middle of the night, and I'd never know it. And that's one thing I love about having that kind of outlet where you can reach people you may never meet on this side of eternity.
That's right. My 13-year-old son, last night, we were on Netflix. We watched The Case for Christ.
Oh, yeah. Oh, no kidding. Awesome.
Yeah. So that content is everywhere. So help us out. You've got listeners who are pastors, ministry leaders, entrepreneurs, and we want to talk about being fearless. Take us back to when you were investigating the claims of Christianity. You were an award-winning writer with the Chicago Tribune. What fueled that pursuit for the truth?
Well, I wish I had pure motives when I began that investigation, but it was really because of my wife's conversion to Christianity. I was an atheist, pretty adamant in my skepticism. Leslie was I call her agnostic. She was kind of spiritually just confused. And when she came to faith and told me that, it was, I thought we were going to get divorced. The first word that went through my mind was divorce. In fact, she had just planted a beautiful flower garden in our backyard. And right after she told me she'd become a Christian, I was so mad. I stormed out of the house and I had to mow the lawn. So I mowed down all of her flowers that she had just planted. I was so upset because I didn't know what she was going to turn into. I didn't want to be married to a Christian. And so even though I did see positive changes in her character and values and the way she related to me and the kids after she became a Christian, and that was winsome and it was attractive, I still wanted the old Leslie back. I wanted her old life back. And so that's what prompted me to take my journalism training and legal training and begin to pursue evidence with the hope that I could rescue her from this cult that she'd gotten involved in. I'm trained in journalism and law. And when I say trained in journalism, that's the old school journalism, that I was trained in. So, you call a fact, you call a ball, a strike. You try to be as objective as you can in pursuing the evidence. So, I didn't try to stack the deck. I went out and said, if I'm going to do this, I'm going to try to be honest about the evaluation of the evidence. And so that's what launched me on that 2-year journey to determine whether there's any credibility to Christianity or any other world religion. And like you, I read the Quran, I read the Book of Mormon, I did all kinds of research, and ultimately it ended up taking 1 year and 9 months to finish it all.
So what surprised you the most about the historical veracity for Christianity? Why didn't you, read the Book of Mormon and start following Joseph Smith, for example?
Yeah.
What was it that was different about this Jesus?
Well, in the case of the Book of Mormon, I wrote the National Museum of Natural History. And I said, okay, I noticed that Mormonism makes certain claims about things that supposedly happened in the Americas a long time ago. What archaeological evidence is there to back that up? And I got a letter back saying there is no direct connection between the claims of the Book of Mormon and the findings of archaeology. So that was a big black mark, a big negative in terms of accepting Mormonism. And yet in the opposite way, the more I would probe Christianity, the more I would investigate the historical underpinnings of the Gospels, for instance, and looked at evidence outside the Bible and looked at archaeological support for claims in the Bible, it would stand up to scrutiny. And so, and then I would read the Quran, and I got to Surah 4, verse 157, I believe it is, 156, that says that Jesus didn't die on the cross. And yet I've got all this historical data, including 5 sources outside the Bible that confirm the death of Jesus. And so I would have a hard time accepting the Quran as being reliable if it's making that kind of a claim. So I didn't find that any other world religion really matched up to Christianity. It's historical in the sense that the more you probe the data, the more you find it supportive of the claims of the faith.
So when you realized that this is real and true, I mean, that's a huge change that would occur in your life. Were you scared? Was it scary to make the changes and shifts in your life?
Well, remarkably no. And the reason is because I was trained to respond to evidence.
Hmm.
I mean, I went to Yale Law School. I learned what evidence is. As a journalist, I was trained at the University of Missouri's journalism school to look at evidence. And when it points powerfully and persuasively, clear and compellingly toward a conclusion, there's a small step that you take to accept it. And it's not a blind leap against the evidence. It's a step in the same direction the evidence is pointing. That's logical. That's rational. We do that every day of our lives, consciously or subconsciously. And so to accept it in the end was not that big of a step because I found the evidence so compelling to do so. It would have been harder for me. I actually came to the place where I said to myself, in light of the evidence I've seen, it would require more faith to maintain my atheism than to become a Christian. So in other words, I pictured it like this river, that's flowing in a direction. Its evidence is flowing in a direction. To maintain my atheism, I'd have to swim upstream against this torrent of evidence flowing the other direction. That's not rational. That's not logical. And so I was just responding. That's why I love engineers. I love physicians. I love scientists because they're trained to respond to facts. And I have a neighborhood full of engineers here in Houston because they all work for the oil industry. And I love those guys. In fact, I recently led a guy to the Lord who was both a retired engineer and lawyer for one of the oil companies. And he was Jewish. And we had long discussions about the evidence. And he, like me, when he saw the evidence, his training and his temperament compelled him to say, okay, this is true. What do I need to do? I need to follow Christ. I need to pray and confess my sin, receive this free gift of forgiveness and eternal life, and let's do it. So we baptized him right before Christmas. So, for me, it just seemed too logical not to do.
Wow. That's a really cool story. I'm just curious. So many people want to share their faith, but they don't want to get labeled,
Yeah.
religious or get in trouble in a PC world. I'm just curious, how did you approach your neighbor? How did that conversation come up?
It's interesting. In Hurricane Harvey, his home was flooded. And he's 76 years old. He and his wife were devastated. They didn't know what to do. Nobody from the synagogue came to help. But a local church sent a couple out, a woman and her daughter, a daughter named Grace, 16 years old, to serve this man and his wife. And they came and they loved on him and they helped him by bringing them meals, and they helped arrange the reconstruction of the lower part of their house to get them recovered from the hurricane. And it just opened their hearts. And so he heard at that, he started to go to that church. And that church invited me to come in to do a men's event to tell my story of going from atheism to faith and the evidence that I found convincing. And so I did, and he came to that, and I met him, and I liked him right off the bat, and I understood he was Jewish and not a believer, and I said, well, let's have lunch. So we had lunch and had what turned out to be an all-afternoon discussion and a lot of other communication, and ultimately got his questions answered, and ended up coming to faith, and he was baptized right before the holidays. So again, someone trained in engineering and law. There's a great combination. He couldn't resist the evidence, and I think the Holy Spirit uses what's necessary to reach people, and people who are wired up that way, and as journalists or engineers or scientists or lawyers, I think God uses that kind of evidence to draw them into the kingdom.
Wow, that's so cool. You know what I like about that story is, like, in my mind, you're Lee Strobel, but you're saying to this guy, let's just go have lunch.
Yeah, he bought too.
Cool.
He actually bought.
So, as you've been writing over 20 books, and you know, your notoriety is grown, your platform has grown, let's say. Help us out as public speakers and authors and the listeners. You're speaking in front of large crowds. You're influencing people with articles. How do you deal with, you know, there's like stage fright, there's got to be critics out there and rejection. Right. How do you deal with all that?
Well, yeah, stage fright. I remember the first time I ever got up before a church to speak, and it was just a small thing I was supposed to do. And they had a musical a worship time beforehand. And at the end of that, I clapped and my hand splashed. They literally splashed. That's how nervous I was. And then I got up and I looked at my notes, and it was just my notes were written in Arabic. I couldn't, my brain wouldn't even process what the note said. I was so nervous. So I understand that. But practice makes perfect. I mean, or at least we get better when we do this over and over again. So the more you do it, you know, just look for opportunities to be able to get out there, and whether it's in front of one person or 10,000, just keep at it, and you'll get better. But I acknowledge the fact that it can be very scary initially. And in terms of critics, yes, especially in this age of internet trolls, you get a lot of people who attack you. They attack you personally. I've had death threats. It's always a balancing act. To what degree do I stop working on my current project, which I believe God's called me to do, and it's an important project and I'm working on it? When do I stop that and turn and spend time responding to critics? That's always a balancing act. Most of the time, I opt for thinking, you know, people are going to see through this criticism. They're going to understand it for what it is, and I'm not going to take the time to respond. A few times I have, and I guess I'm glad I did, but I don't know. I tend to roll with the punches and understand that comes with the territory.
Sure. So I am at a church here in Michigan where we have a lot of 20-somethings, 30-somethings who are hungry, especially now. You know, they're hungry for truth, hungry for hope. Give us kind of your Google Earth zoom out for a second. When you think of the rise of millennials and Gen Z, the Zoomers or whatever they're calling them, what do you see as the biggest challenges in the years ahead as far as sharing our faith, apologetics? What are some of the hurdles that you see?
Well, I think it's really more and more important that we read the entire verse of 1 Peter 3:15. Which is sort of the theme verse for apologists. Set aside Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have, but do it gently and respectfully. And that's the key. You know, I think today, apologetics, defense of the faith, answering tough questions, looks different than it did 30 years ago. In the sense that, number one, we want to ask more questions than give answers. Number two, we want to listen more than talk and preach. We want to respect the other person as someone made in the image of God who matters to God. We want to validate the fact that they're on a journey. It's going to take some time. They may not be as far along as we are. That's okay. I'll give you a literal example of how things have changed. Often, if I'm going to engage with someone about their faith, I'll ask them a question to get the conversation going. And the question is, if you could ask God any one question and you knew he'd give you an answer right now, what would you ask him? Now, if you ask a non-believer that question, my experience, and I've had this validated by independent research I've had commissioned, 80% of people are going to ask some permutation of the why does God allow pain and suffering. It's going to be some permutation of that. So then they ask that, okay, yeah, here, if I could ask God any one question, I knew he'd give me an answer right now. I'd ask, why does a loving God, if he's loving, allow pain and suffering? Oh, okay, well, hey, I just happen to have a 5-point sermon on that. So then I would launch into my little 5-point sermon about why God allows pain and suffering. I don't do that anymore. What I do now is I say, if you could ask God any one question, you knew he'd give you an answer, what would you ask? Well, I'd ask him, why would a loving God allow pain and suffering? And then my response is to ask another question. What I say is, wow, of all the potential questions in the entire universe, why did you ask that one? Now we're getting to the emotional side. Now they say, because my wife has been diagnosed with breast cancer, or because we lost a son in childbirth 5 years ago, and I want to know, where was God when that happened? Or some personal issue, or I just lost my job because of the pandemic, and I don't have any money in the bank, and I don't know what the heck I'm going to do. Or my business is going down the drain. I'm going to go bankrupt. Now we're getting to the emotional side. And now, more often than not, what they're really looking for from me as a follower of Jesus is not a 5-point sermon. They're looking for me to put my arm around their shoulder and say, I am so sorry for what you've gone through. What they need me to be is like Jesus to them in that moment. That, to me, encapsulates the difference of how apologetics has changed. We still need to be prepared to give an answer. We still need to demonstrate to people and help people understand that our faith is well placed, that is historically valid, that it is supported by science and history and logic and reason. But we have to be loving to people. We have to be like Jesus to people. And I find when we do that, it cracks open the hardest of hearts. And I'm more apt to have a follow-up conversation. Because a lot of times when you're engaging with a non-believer, the first question they'll ask is a trial balloon. It may or may not be their greatest question. It's a trial balloon. They're trying to see, how are you going to respond? Are you going to pontificate by lecturing me or giving me a sermon? Or are you really going to listen to me? And if you really listen to them and ask follow-up questions and engage with them personally, then they'll go to the deeper question. Then they'll go to the real issue that's holding them up. I think that kind of encapsulates the difference in approach these days that people need.
That's really good. That is so good. So during this pandemic that you just mentioned, we're seeing lots of businesses, churches, everybody's pivoting quickly to digital ministry.
Yeah.
So what do you see as the advantages? What are some of the opportunities that you see for evangelism and apologetics?
Well, Greg Laurie said something really fascinating the other day. He said, church leaders have been pounding our head against the wall for years, trying to determine, how can I reach the next generation? How can I reach young people, Generation Z and so forth? How can I reach them? And nothing seems to have worked particularly well. But now all of a sudden, the pandemic has forced us into virtual ministry through the internet. And guess what? That's the language of the next generation. They're comfortable on media like this. They're comfortable with Zoom. They're comfortable with watching things on a screen and engaging that way. And all of a sudden, we're able to reach through the medium of the internet, not only more people, but the demographic is shifting. We're reaching younger people. So, for instance, our church, which is a large church, and normally I think our attendance is, about 18,500 on a normal weekend, and at Easter, maybe 40,000 people will come. Well, we were all online this year at Easter. We had over 100,000 people that experienced our service, and we had about 1,000 people come to faith. That's a bigger response than we've ever had. So there has been, a blessing in the midst of this, as difficult as it has been, and as much heartbreak and pain and sorrow as people have experienced. I lost my brother in March to the flu.
I'm sorry.
My older brother. We don't know if it was COVID-19 or just the regular flu, but so we haven't even been able to have a funeral yet because of the pandemic. So a lot of people going through painful times, they're asking questions about God. They're asking questions about the afterlife. Studies have shown that 40% of Christians say that people are more open these days as a result of the pandemic. 22% of non-Christians say people are more open to hearing about God. So I think a couple of things have happened. We've got the technology, and think about that, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, even 10 years ago, we wouldn't have this technology.
Yeah.
What would have happened then? And yet the way things have timed out, we can't gather physically, but yes, we can use technology to reach people. Secondly, that technology tends to skew toward the younger among us. And third, because of the fears that the pandemic is creating, people are more spiritually receptive. So I think it's a tremendous opportunity. I'm praying for a revival. I'm praying for an awakening that will happen. And I've seen some evidence of that. And then in addition to that, we have opportunities for service. You see Samaritan's Purse creating a hospital right there in Central Park in New York City. Our church, we've done 2 blood drives. We've fed hundreds and hundreds of first responders and doctors and nurses. We have all kinds of outreach and so forth that we're doing to nursing homes and things like that. And churches are doing that all over the nation. When Hurricane Harvey hit here in Houston, 75% of the relief efforts were churches.
Wow.
And so when disaster strikes, who steps up? Christians, churches. So as horrible as this situation is, and it is a horrible situation, we can take courage and we can seize this opportunity to talk about ultimate truths and ultimate hope that we have in Christ.
Well, I heard that this fall will be the launch of a brand new endeavor, the Lee Strobel Center for Evangelism and Applied Apologetics. That excites me. Can you share a little bit about that with our listeners?
Yeah, it excites me too. It's a partnership with Colorado Christian University. We're creating undergraduate degrees, bachelor's degree, master's degree. Ultimately, we'll be going hopefully beyond that even. And we're launching our first classes this fall in apologetics and evangelism. So classes on things like the resurrection, personal evangelism training, how churches can become more evangelistically effective, science and faith, how to deal with doubt, the case against atheism, all kinds of, in fact, there are about, I think, 30 courses that are opening this fall. So people can sign up now. They can apply for free using Strobel as a promo code in the box there. And if they want to get a bachelor's degree, a master's degree, or even a minor, they can do that if they're studying something else, or just to take some courses just to grow. And so we've got a team that we put together of about 30 PhDs who are experts in these areas, and they're experts as well in online education. All of this is online, which of course makes it particularly useful in the pandemic days, but all of them are online and accredited. And so we're encouraging people to go to ccu.edu/Strobel Center, STROBEL Center, all one word. And you can get all the information there. We're very excited about it. We really believe that we want to help people not just understand better what we believe as Christians, but why we believe it, how we can share the grace of God, and how we can defend the truth of the Christian claims in an increasingly skeptical and oftentimes hostile culture. So we're thanks for mentioning. We're thrilled with it, and I've just been on Twitter recently, and I mentioned it, and one guy wrote back and said, "I've already registered," which is awesome. We can't wait to see people participate, learn, grow, get a degree, and we're using the term applied apologetics because we're not trying to create ivory tower academics. And nothing wrong with that, but that's not our goal. Our goal is applied apologetics. It's what you're doing. Mm-hmm. It's doing podcasts, it's doing churches, it's writing books, it's doing radio, it's doing film. When we did the Case for Christ movie, it's because we understand that film it communicates to young people especially, and a lot of people won't read a book, but they'll watch a movie. And so we're experimenting with that. We have courses on apologetics in the arts, the use of film, the use of social media and so forth, visual arts to communicate. So we're very excited about it, and we're hopeful that some of your followers will say, yeah, I'd like to explore that, maybe take a few courses, maybe get a degree, maybe get a minor or a master's to be better prepared, as 1 Peter 3:15 tells us to be.
Well, yeah, I'm actually really interested in it myself.
Great.
So I'm a Gen Xer. I grew up, you had to go to school. So help me out. I'm going to sound old to some of our listeners. How does online school work? How are you guys set up? I'm sorry, I've never done that.
That's a great question. You know what? The exciting thing about it is it's awesome. We're using, first of all, the latest technology. We've been interfacing with people in Israel who are consulting with us on the technological side. That it's just awesome stuff. But generally what you do, each course is 5 weeks long, and you go online, like in this kind of Zoom environment, and you have class discussions, and you have a professor that you work with during that 5-week time. And you, just like in a regular class, you may write some papers or do some homework and so forth. But each class is about 5 weeks, and it's a normal kind. Most people will take one class at a time because most people are working at the same time. They've got a ministry or a job or whatever. And but it's perfect for someone who wants to continue to grow while they're working or while they're in ministry. Just to take that 5-week window and focus a bit on a topic that is intriguing to you. So it's really a fun experience. And, honestly, I'm 68 years old, so I guess I'm considered elderly. And I'm personally not very adept at technology, but I'm working on a new book, and normally when I do a book, I travel and I sit down with scholars and face-to-face and interview them for my books. Well, there was a scholar I had to interview for my next book at Oxford, and I wasn't going to go to travel for Oxford, especially with the pandemic. So we did it on Zoom, and it was awesome. I was really amazed at how we really connect. Like, I'm looking you right in your face, as if you're right in front of me. And we had a terrific interview on Zoom. So, golly, the technological side has advanced so far. I would encourage people, if they've never taken an online course, give it a shot. You'll be surprised at how engaging it is. And again, you're working with an actual instructor, and we've got top-notch people who we're working with. So,
and what's the website again, if we want to check that out?
Yeah, it's CCU, Colorado Christian University, ccu.edu/Strobel Center, STROBEL Center, all one word. And it'll take you right to that site. You can click bachelor's or master's degree, and then you can fill a little thing out there for more information to connect with someone on the phone or by email from Colorado Christian. The degree itself is from Colorado Christian University, which, by the way, I have been so impressed with. They are awesome. Just the depth of love of God for evangelism, because this is not just about apologetics, it's about evangelism too. You can, by the way, we have 4 different concentrations that you can go in. So depending on your interest, you can concentrate in innovative evangelism, or you can concentrate in practical apologetics, or you can concentrate in cultural apologetics, which would mean cultural issues like abortion, euthanasia, gay marriage, things like that, or world apologetics, which deals with world religions and so forth. So there's 4 different areas, but the degree is conferred through Colorado Christian University. And so we're hopeful that, golly, it'd be great, Jonathan, for you to take some courses from us, and we'd love to have some of your followers do as well.
Well, for the last 20 years, I've been saying, I don't know when you're going to open up a doctorate program, but I've always said I would love to pursue a doctorate in apologetics.
We'd love to get that going, and we have plans to work on that. So we got to get the master's one down first, and then we'll be moving on. So we have plans even beyond that. So we're excited. We really think that God has opened up technology for us to use to not only reach people directly with the gospel, but also to train and equip Christians. And the beauty of that is we can do it from the comfort of your own home. You don't have to quit your job and move to Colorado. And as beautiful as that campus is, you don't have to give all your life up to become a full-time student.
Wow. That is so cool. Well, listen, our time together is coming to a close. I got to land the plane, and I'm so thankful for all your time and insights. This has been just a great time. But I got one last question. We're the Fearless podcast.
Yeah.
And so our listeners, whatever they're facing at work, ministry, life, they're trying to be fearless about it. What's your one biggest piece of advice that you'd give to listeners about being fearless about what they're facing?
Jesus said in John 16:33, I tell you these things so you may have peace. In this world, you will have trouble, but take courage. I have overcome the world. And a couple of things I keep in mind when I feel fear creeping in is that verse. I go back. Jesus has overcome the world through his resurrection from the dead. And I go back time after time to the truth of the resurrection of Jesus and the solid historical evidence we have to back that up. That gives me what the Bible says in 1 Peter, a living hope, living hope. And it gives me courage. And the other thing I'd say is be sure of your calling. If you are sure of your calling, nothing can get in your way. And how do you do that? You pray, of course, and you seek counsel from godly Christians who know you well. My best buddy, Mark Middleberg, who you've had on your podcast, we've been best friends since 1987. We talk on the phone at least twice a day, every day. It seems like we're joined at the brain. When I'm trying to discern, is God calling me to something, to write this book or to do whatever? Of course, Mark and I pray about it and talk about it, discuss it, but also my wife. God, the Holy Spirit is consistent. He's not going to tell me one thing about my calling and tell my wife something different. And so if there's ever a difference of opinion or a difference of thought about what God's calling us to do, we just use that as a signal, a yellow flag to bathe it more in prayer and to seek wise counsel from others. And then, is it something, this calling, that, how do I put this, is not something we would naturally seek in and of ourselves. So, for instance, people say to me, golly, was it hard for you to leave your journalism career, all you've ever known, and leave it for work at a church? And I said, it was one of the easiest decisions I ever made because I knew it was God's calling in my life. Now, it was a 60% pay cut. And I knew that in and of myself, that's not something I wanted. That's not something I naturally would have sought out. But that's another sign that, if I feel this strongly, this is what God wants me to do, despite the personal cost that would be involved. We felt just so strongly through counsel with others and my wife. And so that it gives us courage in those midst when we shrink back. And, we all do go through seasons where we're a little more fearful than others. But, take courage, Jesus said. He has overcome the world.
Wow. Lee Strobel, New York Times bestselling author and all-around great guy. Thank you.
I've enjoyed it. Thanks, man. It is a wonderful podcast. I hope more and more people are exposed to it. What a great concept for a podcast to talk about fearless leadership. It's one thing we need these days. It's fearless leaders.
Wow, I can't believe it. I got to interview Lee Strobel. I can check that off the bucket list. That was incredible. You know what else was incredible? Next week's episode of the Fearless Podcast, because I'm sitting down with another New York Times bestselling author. He's also an internationally known speaker. He's helping put up children's schools all over the world, like in Afghanistan and crazy hard to reach places. Plus, he's the chief balloon operator of Love Does. Next week on the Fearless Podcast, it's Bob Goff. That's amazing. Bob Goff will be with me next week on the Fearless Podcast. So make sure you're subscribed wherever you listen to podcasts, whether it's Apple or Spotify or Stitcher. Search Fearless Podcast, give it a 5-star review, subscribe, or even better, come join me on YouTube. We have a new YouTube channel. You can subscribe at youtube.com/fearless leadership. Click the little bell and an angel gets its wings. Gang, it's been an honor, a privilege to be with you. Hit me up, jonathanherron.com. I'll see you again next week with special guest Bob Goff on the Fearless Podcast. Enjoy your burrito.